In the quiet hills of Montana, a determined female mechanic named Abigail Sloan inherited a veteran's old hangar that everyone else had written off as worthless. Dust, rust, and silence were all that remained until she uncovered a set of hidden blueprints tucked deep inside the walls. What she found wasn't just a secret design. It was a forgotten mission her father had protected for decades. This inspiring, true-to-life story of how a female mechanic restored a veteran's hangar and reignited a dream buried by time will remind you that some legacies aren't meant to fade. They're meant to fly again. But before we dive in, tell us where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The wind clawed at Abigail Sloan's jacket as she sat inside her aging Ford pickup, parked crookedly outside a modest law office in rural Montana. In her weathered hands lay 2 brass keys, thick, cold, and impossibly old. They felt like they belonged to another time, and to a man the world had long forgotten. Her father. Abigail hadn't said much to anyone since the funeral. Grief came in waves, but this one hit differently. Her mom died while she was overseas with the Navy. And now, at 43, a once proud aviation tech turned out-of-work mechanic. She was completely untethered. Outside. The sharp October air smelled like pine and distant wood smoke. It reminded her of the early mornings she used to share with her dad, sitting in silence on the porch of their worn-out farmhouse, the sky still bruised with dawn. She never knew how much those quiet moments mattered until now. Her repair shop had gone under last spring. Work dried up. The town didn't exactly line up for female mechanics, especially not here. Now, with nothing but memories and a pair of keys no one wanted, she clung to the one thing everyone else had written off. But something inside her whispered, "Don't let go." Not yet. The old access road was narrower than Abigail remembered. Worn tire tracks curled through dry grass and brittle brush, leading her farther into nowhere. Her father hadn't spoken of this place in years. Maybe never. The lawyer had called it just an old military storage site. No one had expected her to visit, least of all her family. But the keys in her pocket, they hadn't let her sleep. Now, after 40 minutes of driving, Abigail crested a hill and slammed on the brakes. There it was. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded what looked like an overgrown airstrip. Beyond it stood a massive, weather-beaten hangar, its curved frame swallowed by vines and silence. One door hung slightly ajar, barely held in place by a twisted padlock. She parked just shy of the gate, the engine ticking in the cool morning air. For a long time, she sat there just watching, listening. There was something sacred about the stillness. Then, slowly, she stepped out, gripping the brass keys tight in her fist. The lock was stiff, but the third key turned with a heavy click. The chain dropped to the ground. She hesitated. The air felt different here, denser somehow, like it hadn't been stirred in years. The doors screeched in protest as she forced them open. A gust of stale, mechanical air rolled out, tinged with rust, dust, and something else she couldn't name. Not oil, not mold. Something preserved. She turned on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a cavernous space full of shadows and secrets. Old shelving, broken crates, a rusted-out generator in the corner, cobwebs thick enough to look like insulation. The roof had leaks. The back wall sagged. And yet, the place stood. Stubborn, just like her father. She walked slowly across the concrete floor, her boots crunching on scattered debris. The light passed over tool benches, dusty cabinets, and what might have once been a work table, though now it was buried under tarps and bird droppings. Everything looked abandoned. And yet, she kept stopping. It wasn't just a shell. There was structure here. Purpose. She brushed away a thick layer of dust from a side cabinet and spotted something that made her frown: a rack of tools arranged perfectly. Wrenches by size, screwdrivers in order, clean, too clean. She turned, scanned the hangar again, and noticed the shelving nearest the center while Dusty wasn't broken like the rest. The beams were reinforced. One section of floor, though covered in grime, had faint tire tracks etched into the cement. This place hadn't been dead for long. She crouched down and placed her hand flat on the concrete. Still cold, but something about it pulsed, like it was waiting. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was her cousin Lacey. Lacey, you seriously went out there? That place is a dump. Just sell it and move on. Abigail, you need money, not memories. Abigail stared at the message for a moment, then locked her screen and slid the phone back into her jacket. She looked around. Cracks in the walls, a broken skylight, a single ceiling fan dangling by a rusted chain. And still this place felt alive. She spent the rest of the day walking every square inch of the hangar. She mapped the layout in her head, noticed details others might miss: insulated panels hidden behind false walls, a vent system that didn't match the blueprint she pulled from the deed office. The hangar wasn't just built. It had been designed. Carefully, deliberately. She found an old electrical panel near the north wall. It looked dead, but when she flipped the main breaker, a small indicator light blinked once, then faded. Something was still connected to power. Her breath caught. By sunset, she stood just inside the open doors, watching the sky burn orange above the hills. The hangar behind her was quiet again, but different now. It wasn't empty. It was holding its breath. Abigail took one last look around, then stepped out into the evening wind. She didn't have proof, not yet. But deep down, something had shifted. This place wasn't abandoned. It had been protected. And whatever it was guarding, her father had trusted her to find it. On the second morning, Abigail Sloan showed up to the hangar with nothing but a broom, a crowbar, and a half-tank of stubborn resolve. The place was filthy. She worked in silence, sweeping layer after layer of dust from the floor, exposing cracked concrete and oil-stained footprints long faded, rusted nails, broken bolts, glass shards. She collected them all, filling buckets like they were evidence of someone else's unfinished story. And maybe they were. By the end of the week, the doors opened smoother. The air didn't smell as stale. The broken light fixtures near the entrance now buzzed faintly, flickering to life after she patched together a working fuse. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Piece by piece, she was waking the place up. She brought in tools from her old shop, hung a new tarp over the open skylight, used scraps of insulation to seal the cracked west wall. Every repair was small, but together, they felt like something larger. Like she wasn't just fixing a building. She was restoring intention. One afternoon, while rewiring a panel near the back wall, Abigail noticed something strange: a thick conduit running upward straight into the ceiling and disappearing behind the far beam. She followed it. It led to a junction box mounted behind an old steel cabinet, one she hadn't moved yet. It took 20 minutes and a lot of swearing, but she finally got the cabinet to slide away. Behind it, a false panel, not part of the hangar's original structure. Her heart rate quickened. She tapped the panel. Hollow! She grabbed her crowbar, wedged it into the seam, and pried. The panel gave way with a sharp crack, revealing a shallow compartment carved into the wall no larger than a suitcase. Inside a sealed metal container. Clean. Untouched by time. No dust, no rust. Like it had been waiting. Abigail carried the box to her workbench. Her hands trembled as she worked the latches loose. They popped open with a hiss of stale air. Inside, wrapped in heavy oilcloth, were a dozen rolled documents tied with cord. She opened the first one slowly. Blueprints. Her breath caught. They weren't hangar schematics. They were designs. Detailed. Precise engineering plans for something she couldn't immediately recognize: a hybrid aircraft, smaller than a jet, sleeker than a drone. Its structure was modular, with notations about emergency supply pods, noise suppression turbines, and a section marked VTOL vertical takeoff confirmed. She unrolled the next. And the next? Each blueprint was more complex than the last. One bore a military-style classification stamp. Project Nexus Prototype. 7, a confidential do not distribute. Her father's handwriting filled the margins. Notes. Calculations. Personal reminders like recalibrate vent system for heat signature masking and field test pending clearance. Q3 window critical. Abigail blinked, stunned. These weren't just ideas. These were functional systems. And her father had helped design them. Or had built them. At the bottom of the container, she found a worn, leather-bound notebook. The cover was plain, but the first page was dated 1998. The second page simply read, "If something happens, and it falls to you start here." The pages inside were a mix of diagrams, logs, troubleshooting notes, and what looked like flight readiness checklists. But what struck her most was how complete it all was. Not just concepts, a plan. A mission! Carefully hidden, meticulously preserved. By a man who never told a soul. Abigail sat for a long time, staring at the open blueprints under the flickering light. All her life, she'd thought her father just couldn't let go of the past, that his long hours in the garage, his guarded silences, were signs of a man stuck in another era. But now, she saw something else. He hadn't been tinkering. He'd been protecting. Not just equipment, but knowledge, possibility, hope, and now, without even knowing it, she had brought it back into the light. She exhaled slowly and whispered into the empty hangar. What were you preparing for? Dad? The silence was deafening, but in her chest, something stirred. Resolve? She stood, rolled the blueprints carefully, and slid them back into the case. Then she looked around the hangar, her hangar, and for the first time since she inherited it, she didn't feel like she was trespassing in someone else's story. She felt like she'd just turned the page. That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. The blueprints were still spread out on the kitchen table, along with the oilcloth wrapper and her father's leather-bound notebook. She'd turned the pages 3 times already. Each time, the words hit a little harder. There was no introduction, no explanation, just date after date, entry after entry. But on the inside back cover, in faded ink and her father's tight handwriting, she found something different. A letter, folded, sealed, tucked between the last page and the leather. She hadn't noticed it before. It read Abigail for when you're ready. She stared at it for a long time before breaking the seal. Abby, if you're holding this, then either I'm gone, or you've gone looking. Either way, I guess it's time. There are things I couldn't explain while I was alive, not because I didn't trust you, but because this wasn't mine to share. Not until now. Project Nexus wasn't a job. It was a promise. We built something that could do good. Something that could go where others couldn't. But the world wasn't ready for it. They were scared of what it meant: a tool that could bypass politics, borders, bureaucracy. So they shut it down. But I couldn't. I kept it alive, quietly, for the day it might be needed. And I kept you close, taught you the systems, the tools, The thinking, not because I wanted you to fix carburetors and change brake pads, but because I knew one day this might fall to you. And if it did, I needed you to understand. You weren't raised to be a mechanic. You were raised to be a guardian. Dad. Abigail read it twice. Then a third time, the words sinking into her ribs like weight she hadn't known she was carrying until it was handed to her. All those years of feeling like she was just patching together the leftover scraps of someone else's war. And now she saw the truth. Her father wasn't escaping the past. He was protecting the future. The next morning, she was still lost in thought when a car pulled up just outside the hangar. It was a faded blue Honda with a dented fender and a missing hubcap. She smiled before she even saw who stepped out. Logan, 18, lanky, awkward in his boots and flannel jacket but growing fast. He was her godson, the child of her best friend from high school, and unofficially the closest thing her father ever had to a grandson. They'd been close, Logan and Thomas Sloan, while other kids buried their faces in screens. Logan had been in the garage with her dad, watching, asking, helping. He was curious in that quiet, old soul kind of way. When her father passed, Logan had barely spoken at the funeral. He hadn't come to the reading of the will. But now, here he was, standing in the middle of the hangar with wide eyes and a shaky voice. "I heard you were out here," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Lacey posted something on Facebook, said you'd lost it." Abigail gave a small laugh. "Not the first time I've been accused of that." Logan looked around, eyes falling on the papers spread across the workbench. "Is that what I think it is?" "Depends," she said, stepping aside so he could see. He moved closer, leaned over, and blinked. This looks like a modular airframe, VTOL capable. Is this military?" "It was," she said. "Now, I don't know what it is, but my father helped design it, and he hid it. From everyone." Logan didn't speak. He just stared. She handed him the leather notebook. "Your granddad wasn't just fixing engines," she said quietly. "He was preserving something, waiting for the world to need it again." Logan flipped a few pages, then looked up at her. "And you think the world needs it now?" Abigail didn't answer. She just looked around the hangar, the lights she'd rewired, the walls she'd patched, the blueprints now exposed to the air after decades of secrecy. And then she looked at him. "I don't think he meant for it to die in silence. That much I know." That night, Abigail stood in the center of the hangar, alone again. She placed a fresh sheet of paper on her father's clipboard. Across the top, she wrote, "Nexus reactivation. Phase 1. Primary objective. Operational assessment, lead custodian. Abigail Sloan." And for the first time, she didn't just see herself as the daughter of a veteran, or a forgotten mechanic, or the last one left. She saw herself as part of something unfinished, something that deserved to rise again. It happened on a Wednesday. The sky was sharp blue, the kind that only happens in October when the air turns cold, but the sun still pretends it's summer. Abigail was in the hangar alone, deep in the middle of reassembling an old inverter from her father's notes, when she heard the sound. Gravel, crunching under tires. She wiped her hands and stepped out. 3 black SUVs were rolling up the access road, government issue. No plates. Windows tinted darker than midnight. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms and waited. The first SUV stopped a few yards away. The doors opened in eerie unison. The woman who stepped out looked like someone used to making people stand when she entered a room. Late 40s, composed, sharp as glass. Her blazer was pressed, her boots polished, her badge tucked into a leather wallet but clearly visible. "Department of Defense." "Miss Sloan," she asked. Depends, Abigail said. Who's asking? I'm Agent Claire Maddox. I believe you've recently uncovered materials tied to a decommissioned federal project, Project Nexus. Abigail tilted her head. So you do remember it? Agent Maddox gave a thin smile. Some of us never forgot. They sat at a folding table inside the hangar, steam rising from Abigail's coffee mug as Maddox laid out a sleek red folder between them. After your father passed, we monitored the hangar for any signs of reactivation. It was part of a dormant asset recovery protocol initiated in the 90s. We didn't expect much. Then, 3 weeks ago, your name flagged on an internal alert. Power usage spike. Communications ping. Document scan signature. You were watching, Abigail said. Only because the asset matters, Maddox replied. Most of what was built under Project Nexus was dismantled or buried, but not this hangar, not your father. She opened the folder. Inside were aerial photos of the hangar, power usage graphs, a copy of the schematic Abigail had found, and a contract. Custodial continuity clause. In absence of federal reassignment, primary custodian, Thomas Sloan. Successor candidate, Abigail Sloan. Pending evaluation. You're telling me this was meant to be passed down? Abigail asked. Incredulous. Unofficially, yes. Maddox said, Nexus was always gray area, humanitarian-based tech. Too bold, too expensive, too pure. So they shelved it. But not Dad, Abigail whispered. No, Maddox said. He believed in it. And from what we've seen you do, too. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then Abigail leaned forward. You want the jet, she said. Maddox shook her head. We want the mission. She pulled out a second folder, this one blue, and slid it across the table. Abigail opened it. Inside were updated versions of her father's designs. Annotations in digital ink, diagrams showing modern adaptations, lighter materials, AI-assisted routing, remote drop controls, emergency deployments, civilian extraction paths. Abigail's eyes flicked across the pages. Words like flood zone rapid response, refugee extraction, and communications blackout override stood out like alarms. This tech could have saved lives, Abigail muttered, and we just let it rot in a hangar. We didn't let it, Maddox said. We were told to walk away. And now the world's burning faster than we can put it out, and we need solutions outside the standard model. Quiet solutions. Fast ones. Ones built by people who still believe. Abigail's hand rested on the blueprint. And you think I'm that person? Maddox gave her the first genuine look she'd seen all day. I think you've already proven it. She left the hangar that night with 3 things. A government-issued sat phone. A signed proposal for a civilian-military experimental partnership. And the growing weight of a question she wasn't sure she could answer yet. Logan found her sitting on the hood of her truck that evening, staring at the mountains. They came, didn't they? He asked. Abigail nodded. What did they want? She handed him the blue folder. He flipped it open slowly, his eyes scanning the diagrams, then pausing on a section labeled Field Test, Phase 1 Remote Relief Drop with Civilian Pilot. His eyes widened. You're going to fly it. I might have to, she said. They don't want the hangar. They want the mission. And what do you want? Abigail didn't answer right away. She looked out across the field. The last light of day brushing gold over the hills. The hangar glowing behind her like it finally belonged to her, not just in name, but in purpose. I think, she said softly, I want to do what my father couldn't. Logan sat beside her, quiet for a while. Then he said, If you go up, I'm going with you. She smiled. Then we better make sure she's ready. Inside the hangar, the lights hummed. The blueprints had been moved to a sealed drawer. The systems had been logged. The checklist was already forming in Abigail's head. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was real. The mission had found its pilot. And the sky for the first time in years didn't look so far away. The first time Abigail Sloan turned the hangar lights on after signing the contract, something felt different. Not just brighter, not just louder. Alive. She stood in the center of the massive space arms crossed, blueprint tube under one arm, and took in everything. The humming electrical panel she'd rebuilt. The sealed storage bins filled with labeled parts. The once cracked floor now patched with concrete she'd mixed herself. For weeks, she had worked alone. Now, she had help. The first person to arrive was Logan. He showed up early, lugging a backpack full of tools and a notebook scribbled full of questions. His enthusiasm hadn't faded. It had evolved. He wanted to understand. Not just what the systems did, but why her father had done it this way, how Abigail was improving it, and how it could go even further. "You ever consider turbine swaps?" he asked one morning. Abigail looked up from a fuel line. "You ever consider coffee before questions?" He grinned. "Already brewed." She smirked. "Then let's talk turbines." Within a week, 2 more people joined. Daniel Pierce, a retired avionics engineer who'd quietly followed the Nexus trials back in the late 90s. He heard rumors that the ghost hangar in Montana had gone active again. When he showed up at Abigail's door with a printout of the original schematic and said, "I thought we weren't crazy," she handed him a badge. Then came Marisol Jang, an emergency logistics specialist from Oregon. She wasn't ex-military. She wasn't a pilot. But she knew exactly how to fit 4 days' worth of medical supplies into a 6x4 drop pod. And she believed. That was enough. The team started small, one table for planning, one for wiring, one for tools. Abigail set up shift boards and safety protocols like she had during her Navy days. She spent mornings training Logan on system diagnostics, afternoons consulting with Daniel on avionics retrofits, and evenings reviewing the newer, digitally updated blueprints Maddox's team had provided. But at night, when the others had gone, she sat alone with her father's notebook, rereading the margins, the hand-drawn arrows, the questions he never finished answering. She spoke to him sometimes, not aloud, just in her thoughts. "I'm not building your dream." "Dad," she'd whisper. "I'm building mine. But you gave me the map." Progress came faster than expected. The central systems responded beautifully to power. Navigation calibration. Smooth. Environmental control. Functional. Even the fuel reserve system, primitive by modern standards, was adaptable. But Abigail wasn't interested in just getting the thing to work. She wanted it to matter. So she started modifying. They redesigned the cargo bay to support quick-swap mission modules from trauma kits to food rations, satellite uplinks to water purifiers. They integrated solar assist power arrays to reduce fuel dependence in long-range relief drops. And she pushed for a completely silent communications relay, something her father had scribbled in half on page 43 of his notebook, and never finished. Now, she would. One night, after 13 straight hours in the hangar, Abigail and Logan sat on the roof, their backs against the still warm metal, sipping from dented thermoses. "You're different," he said, not looking at her. Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Different how? You don't move like you're trying to prove anything anymore." She thought about that. Then she nodded. "For the first time in a long time," she said, "I know what I'm doing matters. Not to win, not to survive, just to do right." Logan stared at the stars a moment. "She'd be proud," he said. Abigail smiled. He would too. By month's end, the hangar had transformed. The old airfield was no longer silent. Trucks came and went. Toolboxes lined the walls. A makeshift command post blinked with screens tracking regional emergency patterns, wildfires, storms, collapsed roads. And in the center of it all, the Nexus craft still under its tarp, but no longer hidden, resting, waiting. One afternoon, Maddox returned with a new proposal. Demonstration flight, she said. Low risk, short range. We've got NGO observers lined up. No weapons, no press, just a drop run to a flood-prone town in the Dakotas. Quiet, fast. Abigail studied the map. We'll go, she said, but on our terms. Maddox raised an eyebrow. Define your terms. I pick the crew, I choose the modules, and Logan flies co-pilot. He's not certified. Abigail crossed her arms. Neither is the aircraft. Maddox blinked. Then, slowly, smiled. Touché. That night, Abigail returned to the hangar alone. She peeled back the tarp. Slowly, reverently. Underneath, the aircraft gleamed under the lights, a machine not of war, but of intention. A vessel built by hands that believed in a better way. Her hands now. She placed her palm against the cold metal and closed her eyes. We're ready. The world hadn't noticed yet. No headlines had been written, no stories aired, no monuments built. But somewhere, in a forgotten corner of Montana, a woman who once thought her best years were behind her was about to change the world, one mission at a time. 3 days after the go-ahead, the first mission launched. There were no cameras, no reporters, no medals or speeches, just wind and urgency, and the smell of aviation fuel hanging thick in the cold Montana air. Abigail Sloan stood in her flight suit beside the Nexus craft, now officially designated NX-1, running through the final checklist. Logan stood beside her, already strapped into the co-pilot's seat, his hands slightly shaking but his eyes sharp. The mission was simple. A late-season flood had cut off 3 rural towns in the Dakotas. Roads were underwater, cell towers were down, a nearby dam was under threat, relief trucks couldn't get through for 36 hours. The goal, get in, drop supplies, get out. Quiet. Fast. Invisible. Exactly what the craft had been designed for. Exactly what her father had envisioned. Altitude control ready, she asked. Green, Logan replied, checking the touch screen. Auto stabilization. Green. Cargo pod 2. Armed and sealed. She nodded once. Then let's fly. The turbines whined to life, soft at first, then rising into a low, almost eerie hum engineered for silence. The hangar's dust swirled under the downwash as the NX-1 lifted off the ground like it had done it 1,000 times. It hadn't flown once, and yet it rose like it remembered. Abigail guided the craft upward, her hands steady. The sky stretched wide and gold ahead of them, and she leveled off with barely a shudder. 30 minutes later, they reached the flood zone. From above, it looked like a forgotten map water curling around farms, roads vanishing beneath brown currents. She dropped the first supply pod over a stranded school. It deployed perfectly. A parachute bloomed open, and it landed on the roof, surrounded by waving children and exhausted parents. The second pod went to a field hospital water filters, satellite radios, emergency insulin. The third to a makeshift rescue boat hub, packed with thermal blankets and headlamps. No one knew where the help came from. But they knew someone had come, back at the hangar that night. Abigail stood alone again, under the quiet hum of the cooling turbines. She didn't cry, but she did close her eyes. And in the silence, she could almost hear her father's voice. You weren't raised to be a mechanic. You were raised to be a guardian. She placed her hand on the hull of the craft and whispered, We're just getting started. The next morning, headlines flickered across underground forums and encrypted feeds. Unidentified aircraft delivers supplies to flooded Midwest towns' witnesses. Call it the Angel Jet. Abigail didn't answer the media. Neither did Maddox. But the message had landed, and people were listening. In the weeks that followed, requests came from everywhere. A wildfire zone in Arizona, a medical blackout in rural Alaska, an island ravaged by landslides after a Pacific storm. People were desperate for solutions that didn't require waiting on broken systems. And now, they knew something or someone was out there doing the work anyway. Word spread, quietly, among engineers, first responders, veterans, relief workers, people who had been told no too many times, people who still believed in yes. They came to Montana, one by one, not because they were invited, but because they understood. Within 2 months, the hangar had become more than a restoration site. It became a movement. They called it the Sloan Initiative, a civilian-led rapid response humanitarian aviation project, built from a forgotten blueprint, fueled by stubborn belief, led by a woman who once thought she had nothing left to offer the world. On the 1-year anniversary of her father's passing, Abigail placed a small plaque on the wall of the hangar, right where the sunlight hit each morning. To Thomas Sloan, you were right to believe the world still deserved saving. She didn't stand for applause. She didn't ask for recognition. She just walked back to the bench, picked up a wrench, and kept working. Because for Abigail Sloan, this was never about legacy. It was about responsibility. And somewhere far above, slicing silently through the clouds, a dark-winged aircraft moved faster than sound and quieter than prayer, carrying hope into places the world had forgotten. Not for glory, not for credit, but because one mechanic chose to fix more than broken metal. She chose to fix what everyone else had given up on. Abigail Sloan didn't inherit money. She didn't inherit fame. She inherited a forgotten building, a few strange blueprints, and the silence of a man who loved in quiet ways. But instead of walking away, she stayed. She listened. She rebuilt. And in doing so, she uncovered not just a hidden aircraft or a buried mission. She uncovered herself. The lesson isn't about aviation. It's not about classified projects or stealth technology. It's about belief. Belief that even if the world forgets you or tells you that your time has passed, there's still something worth fixing. Still something inside you worth flying. Because sometimes all it takes to save the world is one person who chooses not to give up on it. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories that will move you. Click to keep flying with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe forgotten dreams still deserve to soar.